Ever since his initial conception, Sherlock Holmes has captured the minds and imagination of his audience. Up to the present day, Sherlock Holmes has been reinvented and reimagined for every era that he's been in, hundreds of times. However, that hasn't always been a blessing. In an attempt to get the creativity of Sherlock Holmes off of his own hands, Arthur Conan Doyle opened up the doors to allow anyone who was interested in creating for Sherlock Holmes to write different stories for him, via plays and other short stories. These alternate versions of Holmes are more readily accessible than the original Arthur Conan Doyle novelizations and canon. Being more readily accepted, it's these things that people have on their mind when they think of Sherlock Holmes, more often than not. Some of the original character traits that Sherlock Holmes possessed in the books are simply lost over time, and others are exaggerated to an inhuman level. However, not all different adaptations of Sherlock Holmes' stories were exaggerated or nonsensical. It's those stories that I plan on talking about today. There are several adaptations that stand the test of time, adaptations true to Doyle's own vision of the character, some of them even more realistic than Doyle's own canon stories. It's these not-so-hidden gems that we're going to be looking at today. As you might imagine, there are a lot of misconceptions about Sherlock Holmes. Some of them I touched on in the last installment of this series. How he's often interpreted as a cold and calculating machine, robotic, heartless, emotionless, even though he was portrayed very differently in the original novels and short stories. Most of these character flaws are exaggerated in other forms of media, thus making them the most prominent versions of the character. However, if you go back in time a little, we find some very true-to-life versions of Sherlock Holmes that are almost just as popular as the current adaptations. Ronald Howard, Basil Rathbone, and Jeremy Brett. These are names that I'm sure Sherlock Holmes fans will recognize as some of the most classic and faithful film adaptations of the Doyle canon stories. Ronald Howard portrayed the first on-screen appearance of Sherlock Holmes and is a notable inclusion on this list for the fact that his stories are perhaps the most faithful adaptation of what Doyle envisioned. His characterization isn't cold and calculating, but rather fun, charming, and a bit eccentric. But he's still very much an accurate interpretation of Sherlock Holmes.
That woman was guilty as a vulture. Clever, too.
Holmes, I wish you wouldn't forget that we've got to live in these rooms.
Can't imagine why the prosecution didn't think of this.
Well, Mrs. Courtney, so we meet again. No, I shouldn't do that if I were you, Colonel Cavanaugh.
I must congratulate you, Mr. Holmes. You're far more clever than I thought.
Of course, every version of Sherlock Holmes has taken some liberties with the character. Take Basil Rathbone and Jeremy Brett, for example. While both of them do a very good job of recreating the character as accurately as possible, they both make minor changes to the character and certain stories that benefit from more modern understandings of science. This allows them to, in some ways, be even more accurate than the original Sherlock Holmes, who in a few instances made some logical errors. For example, as much as the original Sherlock Holmes was a pioneer in scientific advances and research, I can't help but notice flaws in his reasoning every now and then when I read through the books. It's not possible to get an accurate read of a man's height from his walking pace, shoe size, or gait, While this is indeed useful information, it will never give you an accurate measurement. At best, it will give you a close estimate. This is only one example.
Mr. John Vincent Hardin.
Excellent. The tobacco millionaire. Shall I take notes?
No, I will dictate in the fullness of time.
There's a young lady wishes to see you, Mr. Holmes.
This is not a convenient moment.
She's very well spoken, a genuine lady,
No doubt.
and persistent, too.
Mrs. Hudson, I too am extremely persistent, especially when I'm working.
It is a matter of great urgency, Mr. Holmes, or I would not be troubling you on a Saturday evening.
While the adaptations in question aren't completely exempt from such logical flaws, they are able to avoid a few of them because of the more modern understandings of science they had. Another thing of note about these 3 adaptations is that they paint different pictures of the character. Jeremy Brett's version of Sherlock Holmes, for example, is a very emotional character, laughing at his own blunders, being angry, impatient. In a lot of ways, he is a very outgoing and charming version of Holmes, while Basil Rathbone was a far more reserved, less energetic, and in a lot of ways seemed more controlling. While Ronald Howard's version of Holmes is often referred to as the most adorable version of Holmes. Though every version of Sherlock Holmes changes from variation to variation, there is one thing that we can still glean from them all. Every version of Sherlock Holmes has an undeniable energy about them, no matter what glaring flaws or obvious differences there are between them. An energy that they apply to their methods, their work, their experiments, a passion, if you will, pouring everything they have into their work, whether it be catching Moriarty or discovering methods of detecting bloodstains. It should go without saying that you cannot have a passive interest in deduction. If this is a skill you want to master, you must be passionate about it. Study hard, learn, work hard, and never stop having a curious mind.
No, sir. A gentleman. Only a ruffian deals the blow with the back of the hand. A gentleman uses the straight. And I said I'm a gentleman.